you get to read, and I did get to read a little bit. And so in a few weeks, there's a good chance we're going to take a break from Genesis. My goal was to do Jacob's story and then take a break. But I'm really excited about what we might be doing. So out of that excitement, I may just take a break from Genesis prematurely. If you want a heads up, it'll probably be looking at Psalm 23. And I have taught and preached from Psalm 23 more than any other passage, mostly because of funerals. But I have just been overwhelmed by how much I have missed. So maybe soon. I actually thought about doing it this week, but going to get a few more resources and whatnot again. So, but in the meantime, we're going to be continuing the story of Jacob. Now, Jacob, as you may recall in chapter 31, finally decides enough is enough. He can't put up with his father-in-law anymore. We've all been there. And so he decides to leave, right? So his wife and family are on board and all that drama and stuff. But there's a problem. And the problem is he has burned a lot of bridges in his life. And that's one of the things we see in this passage is there are people who, if they were to survey their life, it is a life of hopping from one relationship to another, not just romantically, but here are people that you know we've grown to love and everything. Something happens, we sever that tie. We're going to move over here. And so if you look at their life, you look at the past, it is just one broken relationship after another, and has affected their family relationships. That they will decide whether or not they're going to come in for Thanksgiving based off of who is there, right? And Jacob is an example of that. Think about it. He has ruined his relationship with his father. He has ruined his relationship with his brother. And now he's ruined his relationship with his father-in-law. Now, Laban certainly is the main cause of that. And along the way, you're just seeing a pile of broken relationships. Well, so he's been going north, right? So he has to flee from his father and his brother. He goes north up to Paddan-aram, which is near Haran, where Abraham came from. And that means that in order for him to come back to the promised land, he has to confront Esau. We've all had that moment, right, where there's that person that we've not talked to for a while, and we don't want to talk to them now. And so we will try to not answer the phone. We'll try to go the other way. I think I've told the story before. The first class I ever taught as a professor, class went great, but there was one student who on their paper that they had to turn in the last day of class, they had plagiarized. And it was obvious they plagiarized because this person clearly could not write this good. Because I read all the other papers, and they were not good writers. I'll just be honest with you. And then all of a sudden, this one sounds like a seminary paper. Turns out it was. And as I'm reading it, I'm thinking, wow, this is right up my alley, right? This is like what I studied. And come out, they just copied and pasted off like the Gospel Coalition website or something. And so I had to turn them in. They failed the class, and they may have been other repercussions. Well, the problem is that class was in Litchfield, and we shopped at the Walmart in Litchfield. And I looked down the aisle, and there is that student. And when that student hadn't gotten a grade from me, I got a bunch of emails saying, hey, have you graded my paper, all that sort of stuff. And instead of me coming out saying, yeah, I failed you, you're a terrible human being, what I did was I had someone else do that for me, right? I said, has the school not contacted you yet? Because then it is the school's responsibility to address that, right? And well, that's where it ended until I saw them. And I said, hey, babe, I'm going to go hang out in electronics, right? I'll be back in about 40 minutes, right? You see that person over there? If they walk out, call me, right? And I had to tell her what happened. Well, that's all fun and games when it's a situation like I couldn't point that person out to you now if they were standing in here, and hopefully it's not one of y'all. But we all have people in our lives like that. Esau is that person for Jacob. And in order for him to return home, he has to pass by Edom, where Esau is the chief. And he has to address all of that. Well, the story begins in verses 1 and 2 at God's camp. Now, this sets up the narrative and gives Jacob the sort of comfort for him to move forward. So verse 1, Jacob went on his way, and the angels of God met him. And when Jacob saw them, he said, "This is God's camp." So he called the name of that place Mahanaim. That name will be on your quiz at the end. You have to pronounce it right. When you see the I am in Hebrew, you got to pronounce it. It's im. It's actually plural. So im is plural in Hebrew. So whatever the main word is, it's plural now, as we'll see. Anyway, so before introducing the drama of the narrative, the writer wants to remind us that God is leading Jacob back to the promised land. So God is shepherding the shepherd. And God will not deceive Jacob the way Jacob has been deceived and has himself deceived others. And this sets up the narrative. Just to remind you, remember when Jacob has that encounter with the ladder, Jacob's ladder or Jacob's stairway, however you want to put it. God says, renewing the covenant, I will not leave you, and I will bring you back to this land. Well, in order for Jacob to come back to the land, he has to deal with Esau. Now, you'll notice there, it's the angels of God. That is a pretty unique phrase in the Bible. The first time we saw it is, again, in chapter 28, verse 12. Remember, he dreamed, he saw the ladder or the stairway, and at the top reached heaven, like the Tower of Babel. Behold, the angels of God were ascending and descending. And remember, angels don't have wings in the Bible, and so they're going up and down the stairway. Cherubim and seraphim and others have wings, but not angels. So they're climbing the stairway and going up and down. Now, in both instances where you meet the angels of God, the context is to assure Jacob that God is with him. Now, remember, the word angels just means messenger. These are the messengers of God. They're the ones who bring news. So the word gospel, good news, in the Greek is literally good angel. It's evangelion. So our daughter, Evangeline, has the word angel in the middle. Evangeline means the one who brings the gospel, the one who brings good news. That's why I love that name. And Amanda and I finally agreed on the girl's name. That took quite a while. Now, you see that the angels are encouraging him. Everything's going to work out just fine. And so he names it Mahanaim. And it picks up on what he says, right? This is God's camp. Now, you'll notice that the word camp there is in the singular. Mahanaim means, it means camp, but it's plural. It actually means two camps. Now, this prepares us for what's about to happen. This place is where God camps, if you will, is what he's saying, right? But the issue is, it's a dual camp. Because what Jacob is going to end up doing, this is foreshadowing, is he's going to split his camp into two parts. Because he's afraid Esau is going to attack. And so he says, basically, if I split it into two parts, it's 50-50 chance. Therefore, if he attacks the camp to the left, the camp to the right can flee, and they'll be safe. If he attacks the camp to the right, the camp to the left will be safe when they flee. So even though it's God's camp, it becomes two camps. But regardless, he is assured that everything will be okay. The rest of it sets up the story of where he meets Saul. Now, Jacob prepares to meet him. And in verse 3 to 5, he clearly thinks this is going to be a hostile encounter. In verse 3, and Jacob sent messengers before him to Esau, his brother, in the land of Seir, the country of Edom, instructing them, Thus you shall say to my lord Esau, Thus says your servant Jacob, I have sojourned with Laban and stayed until now. I have oxen, donkey, flocks, male servants, female servants. I have sent to tell my lord in order that I may find favor in your sight. He clearly thinks this is not going to be a good thing, right? You think about it. Whoever it is you have in mind that you haven't talked to for however many years, you assume, don't you, that if you were to go talk to them, they're still mad at you. Have you ever had an encounter where you're assuming the worst, and maybe they haven't thought about that forever? One of my deacons at Goshen, he loved to tell the story that there was someone he avoided for like 20 years. Because every time he thought of this person, he thought of one instance, right? And so he just thought, man, I crossed the line. I'm just, this guy's going to hate me forever. Finally got a situation where he couldn't avoid the dude, because I think he came into it to shocking range. And after they had like the pleasantries, he just came out and said, look, I'm really sorry for what I did, 20 years ago. He goes, What? I don't remember any of that. He goes, I've been gripped by this for 20 years. And here I just assume. Now, notice that is a type of pride. That person is constantly thinking about you as you're thinking about them. It's just pride, right? And it never made him a happier person, because he's just gripped. Someone is mad at me and has been mad at me 20 years. And they didn't even think about them at all. Now notice, Jacob begins by sending angels to Esau. It's the same word. So just as God sent angels to Jacob, it's the same exact word, because the word just means messengers. Jacob will send his messengers to Esau. And some have interpreted as that, well, if it's working for God, maybe it'll work for me. So God's strategy, I'm going to borrow. I don't know if that's his plan or not. But I want you to notice the detail here. He sent his angels, messengers, before him to Esau his brother, and the land of Seir, the country of Edom. All of that detail is important. First of all, the word Seir literally means hairy. Right? So he's going to go to the hairy place. Now, why is that so important? Right? Just don't go to places called hairy. Right? Is that fair to say? If it's called the hairy place, don't get a wife from there for one, right? Or a husband there, right? They haven't fully evolved, I guess. But what are we as the reader supposed to pick up there? Where does this idea of hairy come from? Esau. Esau's the hairy dude, right? Remember, we made jokes about Esau's the man's man, and Jacob was the soft-skinned mama's boy, right? And the narrative plays with those stereotypes. So here he is. He's afraid of his hairy brother, but he has to go to a place called Hairy to be confronted by his brother. So the language of this verse is bringing up these words to remind us of the conflict between Jacob and Esau. Remember that in Genesis, conflict between brothers usually ends up in death. Cain and Abel, right? Or a permanent separation, Ham, Shem, and Japheth. Rachel and Leah couldn't get along, right? And so not just Seir, notice that it's the land of Seir. This recalls the location, because it's the same word, in which Jacob secured the birthright from Esau. So it isn't just he's going to the hairy place. He's going to the land where the conflict really started with the hairy guy. It's the hairy place. Not only that, notice it's called Edom. This is all details we don't need. He's going to go be confronted by Esau. Guess where Esau lives? In a land called Edom, right? In Seir. Like, we already know that information. We've already been told this. But these words all remind us. The name Edom, its genesis is when Jacob deceives Esau with the red stuff. The red soup, or the red stuff will be a literal translation there, is the word Edom, red. And remember that Esau is a hairy redhead. So Edom is a constant reminder, not just of the color of Esau's hair, and that, he's easily sunburned, but more than that, that their genesis is that they're not the promised seed of God. They're the Edomites. They surrendered those promises for red stuff. So every time that Israelites moving forward in the Bible, we talked a lot about the Edomites in chapter 25, is that the Jews are always calling them the red people, the red stuff people. You remember, Jacob deceived them. And that's why they're still mad at us. They're the red, hairy people, right? And so right here in the third verse, where the writer is just brilliantly saying, don't forget why these two haven't been talking for 20 years. Don't forget that. So in verse 4, he sends a conciliatory note. Say to my lord Esau. This is interesting that we have found through archaeology and historical research that what we have here is probably an actual letter. I don't know if you think about this, but the Bible consists of documents within it. Much like if you read a book about Ronald Reagan, right, and it quotes from his speech at the Berlin Wall. What you have is a document that has within it a document, right, because it's quoting from a document. The Bible's full of these examples. We'll look at one Sunday evening, 1 Corinthians 15, Early Creed. Here's an example one. We have plenty of examples that in encounters like this, what you have is the lesser will use the formula, to my Lord X, say, thus speaks your servant Y. We have tons of examples of this. And so this is probably an actual letter we have from Jacob sent by his messengers, angels, to Esau. And it follows the same ancient Near Eastern pattern that we see in other cases. But notice here, Jacob takes the position of the servants, and he has Esau the position of the Lord. And in one sense, that's true. Esau is a chieftain. He's in charge of the Edomites, the land of Seir. What is Jacob? He's a sojourner. In fact, if you look at the language, he picks up on this. Thus you shall say to my lord Esau, thus says your servant Jacob, I have sojourned with Laban and stayed until now. Jacob possesses nothing. Now remember, the promise, going all the way back to Genesis 12 to Abraham, land and lineage. Here is the promised son of the promised son. What does he have? Lineage, not land. So he comes to his brother who was robbed of the promise. He has the land, but the promised one still doesn't have son. Doesn't have land. Remember in Genesis, faith and patience go hand in hand. Jacob believes the land is his, but he has to pass by the Edomites first. They have land, but they the Israelites, which is Jacob will get his name, Lord willing, next week we'll see it at the end of this chapter. So what Jacob does is he lists his possessions in hoping to buy off Esau's anger. Right? And as we'll see, the way he does it is he keeps trying to overwhelm Esau with generosity. Now, notice verse 68 is the news Esau, or Jacob rather, does not want to hear. The messengers returned to Jacob, saying, we came to your brother Esau. He is coming to meet you. Uh-oh, right? Right? I mean, already you're getting it, right? You know, if you're dating a girl, okay, and you pull up the driveway, you get out, and the dad meets you in the driveway, leave. Right? Right? That's probably what Jacob is thinking right now. Now, if Esau stays in his tent and beckons Jacob to come, that's probably a good thing. But if Esau says, no, I'm going to meet him halfway. Not only that, notice, there are 400 men with him. There's a term for this. A technical term would be militia. I was thinking posse, but militia would be a better term, right? He's got armed guards with him. In fact, 400 men is exactly the way we should look at it as a militia. Let me give you a few examples. Here are three from 1 Samuel. When David, whoever wants to go out to do a brief skirmish, is they will take 400 men. This was a standard militia size. You get 400 of your boys. Now again, like Jacob's been blessed in Laban's land, but not like this. Esau's been overwhelmed with blessings, and he's got an army. What does Jacob have? Wives, sisters who don't get along, like literally sister wives, who don't get along. He's got a lot of possessions, and he's got growing boys, but he ain't got a military. Right? And so he hears Esau's coming to meet you with 400 men. He assumes the worst, assumes the absolute worst. And so we pick up verse 7. Jacob was greatly afraid and distressed, you think. He divided the people who were with him, the flocks and the herds and the camels. By the way, remember before he mentioned his list of possessions, left off camels. Camels are often, still to this day, used in military. You're not going to mention your camels. You may need them to escape. Into two camps, remember the Mahanaim, thinking if Esau comes to one camp and attacks it, then the camp that is left will escape. We've already talked about that. Pick up verse 9. Jacob said, O God of my father Abraham, God of my father Isaac, O Lord, who said to me, return to your country and to your kindred that I may do you good. I am not worthy of the least of all deeds of steadfast love, all the faithfulness that you have shown to your servant. For with only my staff I have crossed this Jordan. Interesting language, isn't it? Because that's how Joshua will cross the Jordan River into the Promised Land. Just interesting little note there. I have become two camps. Verse 11, please deliver me from the hand of my brother, from the hand of Esau, for I fear him. He may come and attack me, the mothers with the children. But you said, I will surely do you good, make your offspring as the sand of the sea, which cannot be numbered for multitude. Here we have Jacob actually praying. This is a real turn in Jacob's character. Remember that his encounter with God at Bethel is where Jacob finally starts to take his faith seriously. And here we see him returning to that. The angels have come to him, and they've told him, like, you're going to be okay. But now that it's gotten real, right, it's am I going to be okay? You know, I mean, there's an army coming. Am I going to be okay? I stole this from a commentary, so this isn't original with me. The commentator broke down this prayer into 5 parts. I think this is actually helpful when it comes to talking about prayer. The first is invocation. Here, he starts with prayer, praising God. O God of my father Abraham and Isaac, O Lord, who said to me, return to your country and my kindred, that I may do you good. I am not worthy of the least of all the deeds of steadfast love and all the faithfulness that you have shown to your servants. Right? So this is praise, right? This is the part of prayer that should be obvious that we so often miss. So we often think, hey, God, I need you to do this. Sign to do it now, right? That's usually our prayers. But in the Bible, often prayer is closely associated to praise. I don't know if you've noticed this, but our worship services have, at the center of it, prayer. So we have a deacon come up. One of the things that we changed shortly after we came here was we want to get our announcements out of the way, and then we want to have our Bibles open and have one of our spiritual leaders, namely our deacons, read from the Word of God and lead the congregation in prayer. And that launches us into an uninterrupted time of worship. Because we see all of those things are involved. You got to do announcements. People got to know what's going on. And you need volunteers for everything in a church. You got to do that. But I grew up in a church where we sang. So we all stood up and sang, and we sat down. We're almost like we're Catholics. And we got announcements. We'd stand up, we'd sing, skip the 3rd verse, okay? And then we'd sit down and we'd do prayer requests. And then we'd stand up and sing, right? And we'd skip the 3rd verse again. And then we'd sit down. Well, you don't sit down. You do the offering. You know why you in most churches, you're still standing for the offertory hymn so you can reach your wallet. I just ruined church for you, didn't I? So that it was constantly being interrupted. We never had. And then I go to camp and we just worship. And I just always loved that. And that's the way we've tried to structure it here. And so we when we open up the Word of God, we try to have prayer, and we want to conclude with prayer. Our communion services are saturated with prayer because prayer and praise go together. The second is recitation. Here, you'll notice that he is reciting God's promises to him. You'll see that in verse 9. It's repeated in verse 12. You said, you're bringing us home. Right? And I believe that, right? So what you have is, God is gooder than we deserve. He's so good. Here are his promises. One promise would be that he stoops to hear the voice of his children like a loving father. Right? That's a simple promise. That because of the work of your Son, the finished work upon the cross and resurrection, we can cry out to you and you hear us. You promise us the assurance of our faith. You're right. He's reciting the promises of God. And this is where, every time I pray publicly, I try to make sure the gospel is in there. And this is the recitation. This is just praying the promises of God. Confession is a big part of prayer. Here you see it in verse 10 where he says, I am not worthy. It literally means I am a small thing. So your translation may say unworthy or not worthy, same thing. It's really I am a small thing. And that is the act of the confessor. It's the act of the humble servant. So he feels small before Esau. Esau's got the army. What does he have? Camels is all he's got. He feels even smaller before God. That is the humble attitude of confession. Petition, where he makes his request for intervention. Lord, you know that my brother, Esau, right? Notice repetition. I'm scared to death of that man. He's a hairy dude with a temper. And he tried to kill me before, right? So I had to flee. And now you've led me down his path. They're going to make me run right into him. I need you to figure this out, will you? And finally, this is interesting. He comes back to restate the promises he's already stated he believes in. And so all of that is they're all related, right? The praise is demonstrated in the recitation. The confession is that he's doubting the recitation, right? But also in seeking intervention, it's a confession of faith, and it's right. They're all together, right? And you wouldn't make that petition unless you believed everything you said in the invocation. Right? It's all connected. I find this to be really, really helpful. By the way, notice the language there in verse 12 that he describes that his sins would be like sand of the sea. This becomes a common metaphor used in the Bible to describe the Israelites. Just to give you a few, first use in Genesis 22, this is when Abraham goes to sacrifice Isaac. Right? How are your offspring going to be sand of the sea if you're killing them? Right? And that's the promise. Genesis 41, Joseph, he stores up grain like the sand of the sea. God is providing not just for the Egyptians, but for the refugees of the Israelites who are coming in. This is used in Samuel, right, in the age of Saul. Solomon uses it, or it's used of Solomon to describe his wisdom. During the time of the Babylonian captivity, the prophets will say, don't worry about Babylon. The Israelites will be like the sand of the sea. One last one. There's a few references in the New Testament. This is the one I wanted to. Here you go, Danny. We're getting some revelation for you. Is that in Revelation, it looks as if the enemy has the sand of the sea, right? And they're going to defeat God. What does God do? God comes and says that's nothing. And so what you get in Revelation is people of every tribe, tongue, language, and people group, like the sand of the sea, are worshiping at the altar. It's really fascinating. Well, in verses 13 to 21, the two of them meet, right? Notice verse 13. So he stayed there that night, and from what he had with him, he took a present for his brother Esau, 200 female goats, 20 male goats, 200 ewes and 20 rams, 30 milking camels. So now he confesses he has camels. Their calves, 40 cows and 10 bulls, 20 female donkeys and 10 male donkeys. These he handed over to his servants. Every drove by itself, and said to his servants, pass on ahead of me and put a space between drove and drove. He instructed the first, when Esau, my brother, meets you and asks you, to whom do you belong? Where are you going? And whose are these ahead of you? Then he shall say, they belong to your servant Jacob. They are a present sent to my lord Esau. Moreover, he is behind us. He likewise instructed the second and the third and all who followed the droves. You shall say the same thing to Esau when you find him. And you shall say, moreover, your servant Jacob is behind us, for he thought I may appease him with the present that goes ahead of me. And afterward I shall see his face. Perhaps he will accept me. So the present passed on ahead of him. He himself stayed that night in the camp. So notice, before he goes to bed, he comes up with this game plan. Now, in the ancient Near Eastern world, it would have been common to exchange gifts like that, the lesser to the greater. And here he speaks the language of servant to a master. He's the sojourner to the chief. And so he takes his possessions, and he puts it, the ESV says drove by drove. It's literally herd by herd. So what you have is stages. So you get the first thing of gifts, right? Basically, this is what every woman wants for Valentine's Day, right? You get a gift. An hour or two later, you get a gift. An hour or two later, you get a gift. An hour or two later, right? Isn't that what you want? I joked about that this last Valentine's Day, that my original plan was to have women drop off flyers to my wife, and then an hour later send another round of gifts so that other women can drop off those gifts, and they're all just jealous of Amanda, right? That's really, ladies, why you want the gifts, is you want other women to be jealous of you. You don't really care. I mean, the flyers are going to die anyways. What do you care? You really just want other women to envy you. I'm on to you, right? And you need to repent and believe the gospel. Anyway, so that's the plan. Now think about it. It makes sense, right? If you receive a gift, you think, well, that's awfully nice of them. You think, oh, there's more, right? Well, maybe I'm not as angry as I was. Oh, you mean there's more? Oh, you mean there's more, right? It's the hope of softening his heart. And we'll see in chapter 33 what actually comes of it. Let me make quickly two applications, and we'll call it a night. Well, what do we do with this story? The first is our past sins will catch up with us. Jacob is guilty of thinking he can just break that relationship and move on, ruin those relationships and move on, and keep the pattern going and never come back around. You can't do it. You can't do it. Whether you live in a large city or a small town, you cannot escape your past. And Jacob learns this the hard way. So the basic advice you give in the story is, don't do that. Don't do that. if there needs to be a separation between you and someone else, let there be peace between you two. How many times when there's conflict and our response is fight or flight rather than reconcile or at least have some sort of peace? Both are bad. Both are bad. So don't choose them. Choose something better. And Jacob prefers to just flee. Esau's preferred, because he's the hairy, strong man, is to fight. And so Esau hasn't had his fight yet. And so Jacob knows this, and he thinks, well, Esau wants revenge. And rightly so. What I did to him was wrong. And because that they've never resolved this, there's the real fear that they're going to resolve it now, and Jacob's going to be the victim here. And that does not lead to peace. So think about it. For 20 years, Jacob has been up north, and you wonder, had he fixed this problem before he left? Maybe he would have left sooner, and he and his family wouldn't have to suffer so much under Laban. You have to deal with the sins of your past. Although I think psychology and the secular approach isn't always the best, I do think there's something about in counseling, you have to address past sins. For example, when you get married, we often think, okay, their story began the day we met. But when you get married, you are marrying their past. Because their past is going to affect you. I've joked about this before. Manda last week, she asked if we had gas to put in the lawnmower. She was, while I was out and about, we can go mow the yard. My past is women do not mow yards. Right? That's my past. Right? Manda's past is women mow yards if they want to. Right? And so this has been not a real sore part, but she has no problem. I have no problem having her mow the yard. Don't misunderstand me, but I just don't want her to mow the yard, right? That's not her job. Okay. Huh? Say it again. Yeah, he's like, go ahead, honey. I'm gonna stay here in air conditioning. But that would definitely bother me. Just look out front yard in my ice cold Coca-Cola, watching her mow the yard, right? That isn't her mower. Yeah, she would prefer that. But she would get the ride mower, of course. Anyways, so what I did was I left home early to mow the yard. Right? Well, that's bypass. That's a silly example. But if there has been a series of broken relationships, and you think you're just going to walk in and act like none of that happened, you're a fool. Unless you deal with your past, it's going to haunt your present. And that's hard to do. And Jacob learns that the hard way. Not addressing our past sins or our past relationships, it will affect you. It will result in loneliness and guilt and shame and bitterness and jealousy. What if you have a broken relationship with one of your parents, and here's a coworker over here who talks about how she and her mom they just talk every day, and you haven't talked to your mom for 10 years. Right? You think you're going to be a happy-go-lucky sort of person? No. You're going to be jealous, Why did mom do that 10 years ago? And I still just can't get over it. In fact, she would do that. In fact, she hasn't seen her grandkids because of that. And then you're going to bring that home, and it's going to show up in a variety of ways, all because there's not forgiveness, there's not confession, there's not reconciliation, there's not peace. So our past sins will catch up with us. Here's the second thing. Because that is true, second is true, sin requires atonement. And this is where the secular world has no answer. It's not enough to address the sins of your past. They have to be crucified. And what we do is often we think we can bear the burdens of that past and we can satisfy the guilt and shame that comes with it, but we can't. Instead, what we need to do is to lay those upon shoulders that are broad enough to satisfy them. Now, obviously, this is where we come to Jesus in this passage, right? But the temptation is to think, I made that up because I'm a preacher, I have to throw in the gospel somewhere. But the gospel is in this passage, and it's right in front of us. We just so easily miss it. What is the story? The story is Jacob. Jacob is having to address his sins. And he knows that nothing he can do can fully wipe that away. In fact, his one plan is to give up everything he has just so he doesn't die. And he knows that if he is murdered by his brother, it's almost justified. Not that murder is justified, but in the sense that he is paying for his past sins. And so he's trying to do what he can to once again deceive his brother by appeasing him through gifts. It's just more deception. But that language of appeasement is interesting. Go down to verse 20. You shall say, moreover, your servant Jacob is behind us, for he thought, I may appease him with the present that goes ahead of me, and afterward I will see his face. Now I have a footnote there after I may appease him. It's number 3, and it says, appease his face. Okay, it's a common Hebrew idiom. Does anyone else have a different translation or a different footnote there? It is a play on words. What follows, and what we see, Lord willing, next week, is Jacob wrestles God. So we saw that Jacob's about to go to bed, and when he's asleep, he wrestles with God. It's when he takes out his hip, right? And that place is called Peniel. And Peniel means the face of God. You see, El there means God. Elijah or Elohim means God. So Peniel means face of God. Now, he's worried about appeasing the face of Esau. But in the wrestling with God, we see what he really needs to do is to appease the face of God. And that language of appeasement is so important. Because although it's not a term we use often anymore, it's a really rich biblical term because this word means atonement. In fact, most of the time that we translate it, what we mean is atonement. Let me give you an example of this. In Exodus 32, Moses said to the people, you have sinned a great sin. So this is the golden calf. And now I will go up to the Lord. Perhaps I can appease his face for your sin. But we translated atonement because that's the word. Atonement is the means by which, through substitution, another satisfies the wrath of God so that the guilty can then go free. That's atonement at one man. And so as a result of that, because the wrath has been satisfied, there can be reconciliation. And until that wrath is satisfied, there can't be peace. And so in the Jewish system, it's all based off the idea of atonement. So if you sin, you sacrifice a lamb or a dove or a goat, whatever, and there's all those sacrifices there. And so what he is trying to do is atone for his sins, and what follows is how God atones for his sins by encountering him at Peniel. This is interesting. You can do with it whatever you want. The first time the word atonement is used, I did not know this, and I don't know how we missed this. It's in Genesis 6, the story of Noah. Make yourself an ark of gopher wood, whatever that is. Make rooms in the ark and cover it in and out. Your translation will really repeat this. Put pitch on the inside, pitch on the outside. It's repetition. The word pitch there is the word atonement.
What?
Atonement. You will make atonement on the ark. Now remember that the connection between Noah's ark and the gospel is very, very clear. At Noah's ark, God saves the righteous and punishes the wicked. At the cross, God punishes the righteous and saves the wicked. So it shouldn't surprise us then that there is the language of atonement at the ark, that then, when Noah gets off the ark, he makes more sacrifices of atonement to cover him and his family. And that sets up the pattern of atonement. It begins right here, that language. So we will usually translate that word there, pitch. I believe it's the only time, at least in the King James, you're going to find the word atonement translated pitch. Perfectly fine translation. But it's a play on words. Because we're to see not just how the ark kept from leaking, that's what it's doing, but more than that, what is the means by which God saved Noah and his family? He saved them from the wrath of God through atonements. So what way we usually translate this is atonement or ransom. Now you see where the gospel comes into play here. If you're trying to address the sins of your past, what you need first and foremost is atonement. Because the reason you're running from your past is because you're trying to carry the burdens of your past and you're trying to atone for them yourself. And what you find is instead of peace, you end up with anger and resentment and loneliness. So if this relationship over here ends badly, you're afraid of starting another relationship because you don't want to go through the heartache again. So you're just stuck in the middle alone. And then you see everybody else seem to have the perfect marriage or the perfect family or the perfect job or the perfect career. And that feeds your bitterness because you're trying to atone for your own sins and the sins of others against you. Here comes the gospel. And it says, no, what you need is to have an encounter with the risen Savior who has satisfied the wrath of God against you and against others, so that you're no longer defined by those events and those sins of omission or commission, sins that you're sinned against and sins where you sin against others. All of that is satisfied in the wrath of God. Enough blood and hate has been shed on your account. You are now free to reconcile. So you can then go and make peace and be at peace even if they don't reciprocate it. Because you've surrendered all of that. It's all been atoned for. It's all been satisfied. The wrath of God is satisfied. And if God's wrath has been satisfied, why care so much? Why be gripped so much by the wrath of people? Doesn't matter anymore. God's been satisfied. So in this story about sins of your past, there is Christ just screaming, what you need is the blood of the cross to have true peace, to satisfy your past so you can have peace in your present and ongoing peace in your future. Isn't the Bible wonderful? I've read this story 1,000 times, and it just jumps off the page when you finally see it. You'll never unsee it ever again, I'm convinced. Okay, Danny, did we miss anything? We got it all. Good deal. All right, well, Lord willing, we'll finish.